Hey there. Tonight we're exploring the forgotten first American Supreme Court. 6 justices with no building, meeting above a New York merchant's exchange and spending more time on horseback than on the bench. Not the marble temple version, you know. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. So drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature, or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. The nation's highest court began as the nation's loneliest road trip. No marble temple, no mountain of precedent, no cameras, no crowds, not even a permanent address. In February 1790, the Supreme Court of the United States opened for business in a borrowed room inside New York City's Royal Exchange building. Looking less like the summit of American law and more like a startup with shaky Wi-Fi, the justices showed up, called the session to order, admitted some lawyers to practice, and went home without hearing a single case. The first term ended on February 10th, 1790, with exactly 0 opinions. That is the founding vibe of the court that would eventually decide everything from segregated schools to same-sex marriage. It started by doing nothing. The Judiciary Act of 1789, signed on September 24th, sketched the blueprint. 6 justices would sit at the top. 1 Chief Justice and 5 associates. President George Washington picked the first roster with the caution of a man choosing a jury for a trial about the Constitution itself. He named John Jay as Chief Justice, then rounded out the bench with John Rutledge, William Cushing, James Wilson, John Blair Jr., and Robert H. Harrison. One immediate problem surfaced. Harrison said no. The first Supreme Court suffered its first refusal before it even held a session. Washington replaced him with James Iredell, who took his seat in May 1790. The court still made its debut in early February with a skeleton crew. Anyone picturing powdered wigs and British pomp can take a breath. The early court looked American by design. Wigs were mostly out, robes were in, but not always the plain black ones seen today. John Jay favored a black gown trimmed with red and white silk, an outfit that said serious lawyer with just a touch of 4th of July. On opening day, the justices gathered at the Royal Exchange in Manhattan, a 2-story building with a coffeehouse vibe on the first floor and courtrooms up top. The capital then was New York. The decor was second-hand. The audience was sparse. The Supreme Court of the United States felt less like Olympus and more like a Sunday meeting above a market. Then came the second awkward truth. In 1790, the justices spent almost no time in that courtroom. Under the same Judiciary Act of 1789, they were ordered to ride circuit twice a year, bouncing across the new nation to preside over regional circuit courts, along with local district judges. 3 circuits existed at the start: Eastern, Middle, Southern. Each justice rotated through them, clocking hundreds of miles at a time on horses and stagecoaches, eating whatever a tavern could slaughter, and sleeping in beds that attacked. Justice James Iredell complained in a 1792 letter that the fleas on circuit were beyond all calculation. That is not a metaphor. It is a travel advisory. The pay did not sweeten the deal. The Chief Justice earned $4,000. Associates earned $3,500. The country was barely paying its war debts. Congress kept the budget tight. The court did not even have an official reporter on salary. Alexander Dallas, a Philadelphia journalist and lawyer with a side hustle in publishing, took it upon himself to compile decisions as a private venture. The first 4 volumes of the United States reports are his work. To fill them out, he mixed in Pennsylvania cases alongside Supreme Court opinions, because, frankly, there were not many Supreme Court opinions to print. The United States reports start with a collage, because the federal docket looked like a ghost town. Still, in that quiet, a few foundations were poured. In 1792, Congress passed the Invalid Pensions Act, telling circuit courts to review claims from Revolutionary War veterans. The catch was fatal to the plan. The statute said the Secretary of War could revise those judicial determinations. The justices, while riding circuit, filed formal letters to President Washington. The letters appear in the saga often called Hayburn's case. They declared that having judges act as pension commissioners, subject to revision by an executive officer, would violate the Constitution's separation of powers. Courts judge. They do not file recommendations that a cabinet secretary can rewrite. Congress backed down and fixed the statute in 1793. The court never issued a final ruling. Yet those letters, printed in Dallas's reports, show a young judiciary drawing a bright line. A year later, the executive branch tried a different route to get legal comfort. War had erupted in Europe. The United States wanted to stay out of it. President Washington and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson sought an advisory opinion from the Supreme Court on how to interpret treaties with France, especially the 1778 alliance, in light of the Neutrality Proclamation of April 22, 1793. The justices returned a polite no. In their response, dated August 8, 1793, they wrote that the separation of powers made federal courts incapable of issuing advice outside actual cases. Courts decide controversies. They do not do homework for the White House. That refusal, led by Chief Justice Jay, became another unwritten rule. No advisory opinions at the federal level. The early docket soon produced a political thunderclap. Chisholm. Georgia arrived in 1793. A South Carolina executor named Alexander Chisholm sued the state of Georgia on behalf of a merchant, Robert Farquhar, trying to collect on a Revolutionary War debt. Georgia refused to appear, waving the banner of state sovereignty. The Supreme Court, by a 4-1 vote, held that Article 3 allowed such suits. Chief Justice John Jay joined Justices James Wilson, John Blair Jr., and William Cushing in the majority. Justice James Dell dissented. He argued that states retained sovereign immunity unless they explicitly consented to be sued. The decision was a cannon blast against the 18th century notion that a state could not be hailed into court by a private citizen. The blast echoed into Congress. Outrage from state governments turned bipartisan. The 11th Amendment was proposed in 1794 and ratified on February 7th, 1795. It reversed the rule and told federal courts to keep out of suits brought against a state by citizens of another state or a foreign country. Iredell's dissent essentially became constitutional law. The court had flexed, and the political branches and the states flexed right back. The first court kept lurching through misunderstandings like this because the Constitution left the judiciary's muscles poorly defined. Federalist? No. 78, written by Alexander Hamilton in 1788, argued for a judiciary with neither the purse nor the sword. Only judgment. That sounded dignified. It also meant the court had to invent its own gravitas. Sometimes it had to invent it while dodging disease. Philadelphia became the national capital in 1790, putting the Supreme Court in the old City Hall on 5th and Chestnut. Yellow fever killed about 5,000 people in the 1793 epidemic, enough death to empty streets. Government business scattered for safety. The court adjusted its terms and carried on. Then, real-world politics swirled in. Chief Justice John Jay did not simply sit and write opinions. In 1794, Washington dispatched him to London to negotiate a peace with Great Britain and stop the kind of naval harassment that kept dragging American merchants toward bankruptcy. The result, known as the Jay Treaty, was signed November 19, 1794, and ratified by the Senate on June 24, 1795, by a 20-10 vote. Jay's fellow citizens burned him in effigy for months. He did not care. He came home and took the governorship of New York, winning the 1795 election after losing in 1792 to George Clinton. The Chief Justice left the Supreme Court to become a politician again. In 1800, President John Adams tried to lure him back to the bench with another appointment as Chief Justice. Jay refused in a letter dated January 2nd, 1801. He wrote that the court lacked energy, weight, and dignity. The future would contradict him. The judgment in 1801 made sense. The seat Jay vacated became a 5-alarm drama. Washington used a recess appointment to name John Rutledge as Chief Justice in July 1795. Rutledge had been one of the first 6 associates in 1789 and had resigned in 1791 to become Chief Justice of South Carolina's highest court. He came back for the big chair and then detonated his own nomination. On July 16, 1795, he delivered a public speech in Charleston, blasting the Jay Treaty as precarious and dangerous. The Federalist Senate, already skeptical of his mental stability after rumors of depression, rebuked the outburst. On December 15, 1795, the Senate rejected him, reportedly by a 10-14 vote. The Supreme Court's second Chief Justice lost his confirmation and resigned from the court in disgrace. He attempted to drown himself days later and survived. That incident belongs to the raw, unsentimental past of American judicial politics. Washington then turned to William Cushing, who had been an associate justice since 1789. Cushing accepted the nomination to be Chief Justice in January 1796. The Senate confirmed, and he appeared to take the commission. Then he backed out, still plagued by health issues. He returned to his associate seat and remained there until 1810. Finally, Washington nominated Oliver Ellsworth, a Connecticut statesman and one of the architects of the Judiciary Act of 1789. The Senate confirmed him March 4th, 1796, and the court found a steady hand. Ellsworth inherited a bench that still decided cases in the British style of seriatim opinions. Each justice wrote separately. No single majority voice spoke for the court. One case at a time, the bench built a map of federal power. Ware v. Hilton in 1796 stands out. During the war, the Virginia legislature had allowed debtors to discharge obligations to British creditors using state paper. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 preserved those private debts. The Supreme Court held that the treaty trumped Virginia's statute. Alexander Hamilton argued for the British creditors. A prominent Virginia lawyer named John Marshall argued for the debtor and lost. The Supremacy Clause did exactly what its text promised. Federal treaties beat state laws on matters within federal purview. That ruling came with a bonus message. The court struck down a state statute because it clashed with federal law. Judicial review of state laws had arrived before the famous case of Marbury v. Madison never hit a docket. The court edged even closer to constitutional self-assertion the same year. In Hilton, Fair, United States, 1796, it confronted the federal carriage tax of 1794 and the question of whether it counted as a direct tax. If it did, it would have to be apportioned among the states by population under Article Y. The justices said no. A tax on carriages counted as an indirect tax or duty, not a direct one. The law survived. That decision marks the first time the Supreme Court reviewed the constitutionality of an act of Congress and upheld it. Judicial review did not burst into being in 1803. Like a comet, it appeared in the 1790s, subtle and methodical. While all that lawyering unfolded in Philadelphia, the same justices doubled as circuit judges carrying out the less glamorous work of the new nation. Whiskey tax resistors in 1794 marched under banners in western Pennsylvania, jeering federal authority with muskets in hand. Riding circuit, Supreme Court justices oversaw grand juries, delivered charges about treason, and handled trials that could have become executions. President Washington assembled an army of roughly 13,000 militiamen and rode part of the way west to show the flag. The rebellion fizzled. 2 men were convicted of treason and then pardoned. That episode made the Supreme Court's circuit duty look less like a law school seminar and more like the interface between a fragile state and its citizens, enforced by men who had to sleep at taverns with fleas. The docket contained other crucibles of sovereignty. In Glass v. the sloop Betsy in 1794, the court held that prize cases arising from captures at sea belonged in federal courts, not in tribunals set up by French consuls on American soil. That decision reinforced the idea that American sovereignty ran through American courts. In Georgia v. Brailsford, in 1794, Chief Justice Jay told a jury it had the right to judge the law as well as the facts, a line later invoked in debates over jury nullification. The case involved British creditors and sequestration laws passed during the Revolution. The jury did what juries do. It decided. The court deferred. The building of norms looked messy and perfectly 18th century. The early court's membership turned over like a small band playing in a storm. John Rutledge resigned in 1791. Thomas Johnson, Washington's close friend and a former Maryland governor, filled the seat in 1791 and quit in 1793, explaining that circuit riding would kill him. The vacancy went to William Patterson, a framer from New Jersey who had drafted major parts of the Judiciary Act itself. John Blair, Jr. resigned in 1796 from ill health, and Washington replaced him with Samuel Chase of Maryland, a passionate Federalist who later earned the unpleasant distinction of being the only Supreme Court justice ever impeached in 1804, before being acquitted by the Senate in 1805. James Wilson, a pioneer of American constitutional thought and a signer of the Declaration, speculated in Western lands and died in 1798 in debt. After spending time in a Burlington, New Jersey jail, he died in Edenton, North Carolina, while on circuit on August 21st, 1798. James Iredell died a year later, in 1799 at the age of 48. By the end of the century, only William Cushing remained from the class of 1789. Politically, the court felt like a junior varsity squad during those years. The justices served as statesmen on leave. Jay negotiated the Jay Treaty. Ellsworth sailed to France in 1799 as a special envoy with William Vans Murray and William R. Davy to end the quasi-war. That mission produced the Convention of 1800, signed on September 30th, which calmed hostilities. Ellsworth resigned in 1800 due to poor health, his body wrecked by the trip. The Chief Justice of the United States had just taken a diplomatic assignment, then quit. That is how much prestige the branch wielded. It had ideals. It did not yet have gravity. Yet, case by case, principle by principle, the institution laid tracks. Consider Calder v. Bull in 1798. The issue involved a Connecticut legislative act granting a new hearing in a probate case after a lower court had settled an estate. A litigant argued that the act was an ex post facto law prohibited by Article 1. Justice Samuel Chase wrote that the ex post facto clause applied only to criminal laws, not civil matters. Justice Iredell countered that courts should stick close to text, a caution he had voiced earlier. The back and forth exposed a core American tension. How much natural law should anchor constitutional interpretation? And how much should judges confine themselves to the document's words and structure? The decision set a limit that still stands. Ex post facto restrictions target criminal punishments, not property cases. The justices even planted a flag on the sensitive border of citizenship. In Talbot v. Jensen in 1795, the court dealt with a privateer who had captured a Dutch prize while arguably acting under the French flag. The case dragged questions of dual citizenship and allegiance into the open. The court concluded that citizens who accepted foreign commissions could be treated as pirates in certain circumstances. It also displayed the court's willingness to deal with messy matters of international identity. Like everything else in the 1790s, the decision mixed law with war and an adolescent sense of nationhood. One persistent myth keeps trying to retroactively level the chaos into a clean line. The myth holds that judicial review sprang from Marbury v. Madison in 1803 like Athena from Zeus, fully formed and draped in inevitability. The appeal of that myth is obvious. A single dramatic episode feels better than decades of footnotes. The early record tells a less cinematic, more interesting story. Hayburn's case showed the justices asserting separation of powers in 1792, where B. Hilton in 1796 invalidated a state statute in favor of a federal treaty. Hilton, United States in 1796, reviewed a congressional tax and upheld it. By the time William Marbury's commission became political kindling, the court had already tested the scaffolding. Marbury cemented one brick. The house had more than one beam. That clarity matters in a very practical way when examining the court's first audience. Litigants in the 1790s used the Supreme Court for disputes that modern viewers might find oddly specific. West v. Barnes in 1791, the court's first reported decision, concerned whether a procedural step in appealing from a circuit court had been done correctly. The court insisted on strict compliance with the rule that a writ of error be issued by the clerk of the Supreme Court within a set time window. It dismissed the case on technical grounds. Very few fires burned there, yet that procedural rigor kept the embryonic federal court system disciplined. The justices were telling a new republic that rules mattered as much as results. Even the way decisions were published reveals how shaky the ground looked. Reporter Alexander Dallas made his living as a newspaper editor and lawyer. He published court opinions at his own expense and sold the volumes to recoup costs. The early United States reports carry Dallas's name. He filled the first book with Pennsylvania Supreme Court cases dating back to 1754 because the U.S. Supreme Court had not produced enough opinions yet. The early republic outsourced its judicial memory to a freelancer. That arrangement would horrify modern readers who think of courts as fountains of bound volumes. It also underscores how the court's authority at the start depended less on thunderous decrees and more on the slow work of recording, citing, and building. Circuit riding remained the court's defining pain point through the 1790s. Per the Judiciary Act, every justice had to ride to each district in his assigned circuit twice a year. The Eastern Circuit dragged a justice from New York to Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, which was still part of Massachusetts. The Middle Circuit ran from Pennsylvania to New Jersey, and down to Virginia. The Southern Circuit stretched into the Carolinas and Georgia. Roads drowned in spring and froze in winter. Stagecoach wheels cracked, lodgings reeked. A justice could spend more time bouncing in a coach than reading a record. The job description read like a dare. Some tried to dodge the duty. Congress tinkered with the circuit system in 1793 and again in 1797 to reduce the burden, with limited success. Justices kept resigning from exhaustion. Thomas Johnson left in 1793, citing the hardship. John Blair left in 1796. Ellsworth left in 1800. Presidents struggled to recruit replacements. In 1800, John Adams offered John Jay the Chief Justiceship again. Jay's letter back made headlines. He wrote that the Supreme Court would not acquire the energy, weight, and dignity that were essential to command the respect of the nation. That line dripped with experience. It was also about to be proven spectacularly wrong. Before that turning point, one last constitutional convulsion hit. The election of 1800 threw a wrench into the judiciary. Outgoing President Adams and the Federalist Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, signed February 13, 1801, which created new circuit judgeships and relieved Supreme Court justices of circuit riding. It also shrank the Supreme Court from 6 justices to 5 upon the next vacancy, a partisan attempt to keep Jeffersonians from filling seats. Adams hustled to appoint 16 circuit judges, the so-called midnight judges. He also nominated a sitting Secretary of State as Chief Justice. That man was John Marshall. The act landed like a frag grenade in a room full of anti-federalist furniture. The Jeffersonian Congress answered with the Judiciary Act of 1802. It repealed the 1801 Act, abolished the new judgeships, and put the justices back on the road. It also cancelled the Supreme Court's June 1802 term, ensuring that the High Tribunal would not meet for 14 months. The first Supreme Court's life ended in a constitutional stress test that rippled into Stuart v. Laird in 1803, where the Marshall Court upheld Congress's authority to reorganize the federal judiciary and accepted the constitutionality of circuit riding. The headline belongs to Marbury v. Madison in 1803, where Chief Justice Marshall declared part of Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional, stating that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. The backstory belongs to the generation before him. The practice of judicial review had already crept into the routine of American law. Marshall turned a practice into a principle, and a principle into a brand. That brand rested on precedent. The First Court had already stamped. Advisory opinions were off the menu. As of 1793, state sovereign immunity had been redrawn by the 11th Amendment in 1795. The supremacy of treaties over state statutes stood on Ware v. Hilton in 1796. The constitutionality of congressional statutes had survived review in Hilton v. United States the same year. The court's jurisdiction over admiralty and prize had been asserted in Glass v. the sloop Betsy in 1794. Juries had been instructed to judge law and facts in Georgia v. Brailsford in 1794, then largely reined in afterward by practice and later doctrine. The physical meeting places set the tone. New York's Royal Exchange, Philadelphia's Old City Hall, Washington, D.C. Capitol, where the court moved in 1801 and sat in a basement room that looked like an overachieving cellar. No single building belonged to the court until 1935. The institution began as a renter. Another myth falls apart in this timeline. Many assume the court always had 9 members. In 1789, it had 6. In 1801, Congress attempted to reduce it to 5. In 1807, Congress raised it to 7 to accommodate new circuits. In 1837, Congress raised it to 9. In 1863, Congress pushed it to 10. In 1866, Congress tried to shrink it to 7 by attrition to block President Andrew Johnson from making appointments. In 1869, Congress set it at 9. The bench size has changed as often as the national mood. The sacred number 9 arrived long after the founders went to their graves. The first court does not align with the pop culture image for one more reason. The justices were not cloistered monks. They were politicians, land speculators, pamphleteers, and ambassadors wearing robes in between. John Jay ran for governor while still Chief Justice in 1792. He lost to George Clinton in a messy vote count where ballots from Otsego County were rejected. He then negotiated the Jay Treaty, which made him a hero to merchants and a villain to many farmers. He then resigned to become governor. James Wilson mapped out sovereignty in lectures and opinions, and then drowned in unpaid loans during the biggest land bubble of the era. Samuel Chase charged juries under the Sedition Act of 1798 on circuit with a partisanship that would later get him impeached. Oliver Ellsworth wrote the Judiciary Act of 1789 and then enforced it for 4 years before withdrawing to a farm in Connecticut to die. These men invented American judicial independence while still living as 18th century power brokers. The contradiction gave the court character. It also gave it scars. Controversy over the Jay Treaty still stands as a prism. The treaty's terms included British evacuation from northwestern forts, the creation of mixed commissions to settle debts and maritime claims, and the opening of limited trade in the Caribbean. It did not secure compensation for enslaved people carried off by the British. It did not solve impressment. It was technically narrow and politically radioactive. When Rutledge denounced it, he embraced the role of tribune and lost the job of a lifetime. When Jay negotiated it, he defended the treaty as essential to war avoidance and then walked. Both men treated the Supreme Court as a stop on the way to something more urgent. These choices told Congress something it already suspected. The judiciary would not gain majesty by decree. It would gain it by endurance. Then there is the story hidden in the delivery of opinions. Early decisions were often unsigned or only lightly reasoned. The justices wrote separately and spoke in a restrained tone. That habit came straight from Britain, where seriatim opinions were standard. It also meant the court lacked a single, authorial voice that could train the public to listen. The cultural power of a majority opinion, the idea that this is the law of the court, grew under John Marshall, who preferred unity and crafted it case by case. The first court kept the flame alive. It did not create that bonfire. Its method matched a world that thought of law as something to be argued through reason and text, rather than announced from a podium. A single step in court administration shows the effect. The early court met twice a year, in February and August. The August term got hammered by summer disease outbreaks and travel disruptions. In 1790 and 1791, the court did not hear many arguments. In 1793, yellow fever in Philadelphia scared everyone out of town. The court's docket in 1794 and 1795 started to fill, but still lagged behind the expectations that come from modern Supreme Court sessions. A small number of published opinions from that decade exist, scattered across Dallas's second, third, and fourth volumes. Each one reads like a stone placed in a rickety footbridge. Cross at your own risk. Next term, another stone would appear. The human details feed the memory better than the legal citations. James Iredell traveled from North Carolina to Philadelphia, stopping at inns whose ideas about cleanliness were a lost cause. He wrote to his wife about wretched roads and worse beds. The justices often lodged with local lawyers and judges while on circuit, turning the judiciary into a traveling seminar. In Savannah, in Charleston, in Richmond, the presence of a Supreme Court justice meant a packed calendar of dinners and backroom lessons on federal law. That is how the new system took root, not through blaring edicts, but through conversations and cross-examination before small crowds. Ironically, the first court also helped invent a kind of federalism that dignified state courts even while claiming ultimate appellate power. Section 25 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 allowed the Supreme Court to review final judgments of state courts when they involved federal law, treaties, or the Constitution. That provision became crucial in later cases like Martin v. Hunter's Lessee in 1816 under Justice Joseph Story. The early justices rarely had to use it. Its existence sat there like a loaded spring. It told state judges that their rulings could be the final word in most matters, but not the last word in disputes about federal power. The early court, therefore, promoted state adjudication 7 days a week while reserving Sunday for itself. The first court's forgotten triumph, then, was negative space. What it refused to do mattered as much as what it did. Advisory opinions, turned away in 1793, kept the judiciary from becoming an arm of the presidency. Chisholm, Georgia sparked a constitutional amendment that set a floor under state immunity, keeping the peace without dissolving federal authority. Circuit riding cemented federal law into the circuit the hard way. The seriatim style delayed the rise of a single judicial voice, which made the court cautious in its first decade. The public, meanwhile, got used to seeing judges who were not governors and cabinet officers, but who nonetheless carried enormous power. That visibility and restraint proved healthier than silence. There is also the small matter of robes. John Jay's robe belonged to a transitional aesthetic, a courtroom halfway between royal theatrics and republican simplicity. Oliver Ellsworth preferred something closer to British formality. John Marshall later standardized the plain black robe that became the American norm. Early justices used powdered hair, but mostly ditched wigs, a decision that seems trivial until considering how much the new republic wanted to look like itself. Even in fashion, the court made choices that echoed a political philosophy. It kept the dignity. It shed the monarchy. By 1800, the Supreme Court had held sessions in 2 cities and was about to move again. New York's Royal Exchange framed its birth. Philadelphia's Old City Hall hosted its adolescence from 1791 to 1800. In 1801, the government decamped to Washington, D.C. The court ended up in an unfinished Capitol, meeting in cramped quarters. In that basement setting, with raw brick and damp air, the court prepared to meet a series of cases that would define it. Every famous sentence that gets taught in civics class stands on this underappreciated floor. The no drama of 1790 made space for the drama of 1803. The appeal of the simple story. Heroic judges in wigs inventing judicial review in a flash gets weaker when the stitches show. What makes the early court memorable is how normal it looked in the middle of a national experiment. Part of the bench's job was to referee arguments about creditors and prize ships. Part of it was to say no to kingship habits in a nation that had just broken a king. Part of it was to take the flak when the states felt insulted, as they did in Chisholm. Part of it was to accept discipline when the 11th Amendment arrived with the force of public opinion and state legislatures behind it. The justices fell ill. They resigned. They died young. They wrote opinions in hotel rooms and circuit courthouses. They made mistakes. They learned. A quick roll call of key opinions from 1790 to 1800 reads like capsule history. West v. Barnes, 1791. Procedural rigor without passion. Chisholm, Vive. Georgia, 1793. Sovereign immunity tested and reversed by amendment. Glass v. The sloop Betsy, 1794. Prize jurisdiction affirmed. Georgia v. Brailsford, 1794. Juries briefly told they could judge law as well as fact. Talbot v. Jansen, 1795. Citizenship and prize entanglements. Hyleton v. United States, 1796. First review of a federal statute. Carriage tax upheld. Ware verve. Hilton, 1796. Treaty supremacy over state law. Hamilton pitted against Marshall in argument. Calder v. Bull, 1798. Ex post facto limits clarified. Natural law teased at. Textual discipline demanded. Hollingsworth v. Virginia, 1798. 11th Amendment procedural questions addressed. Each name still appears in contemporary Supreme Court citations. Each opinion remains a breadcrumb on the trail. Behind those crumbs stands the machinery. The Constitution gave Article 3 less ink than Article I. Congress had to build a working system out of skeleton lines. The First Court did not merely interpret that system. It embodied it. It left Philadelphia in one piece. It withstood political storms, a yellow fever pandemic, and internal fragility. It allowed the executive and legislative branches a wide berth without surrendering its right to say no. It treated treaties as supreme when they said so. It treated statutes as binding until they violated the charter that put the court in the room. It kept its robes simple and its opinions spare at a time when legal language loved florid phrases. That stubborn normality forgave a lot of the rest. For anyone tracking the rise of judicial independence, the refusal to render advisory opinions remains the pivotal scene. The letter of August 8, 1793, conveys a sense of judicial self-respect that runs ahead of public clamour. The justices understood that once courts become the president's day planners, the balance breaks. They reserved their authority for cases, and in doing so, they protected the space needed to grow. The refusal duplicated a practice already familiar in some states, but at the federal level, it stuck. Today, the Supreme Court still quotes that principle when advocates seek declaratory answers unmoored from an actual dispute. The silence in 1793 still speaks. The human epilogue belongs to Jay. His letter to Adams in 1801 ranks as a minor classic of institutional pessimism. He had spent years living the burden of the job. He had negotiated a treaty that preserved peace at the cost of personal popularity. He had watched the Senate torch a fellow justice. He had watched the court's docket flicker. It made sense for him to conclude that the court would never command respect. He had the data. It did not have the forecast. John Marshall's tenure would transform the court into a co-equal branch through presence and prose. That transformation took root in soil that Jay and his colleagues had tended, day by sweaty day, term by empty term. The long road from a room above a market in 1790 to a marble building in 1935 looks inevitable only in hindsight. The first decade of the Supreme Court was a series of gestures that looked modest at the time. A letter politely refusing advice, a decision insisting that treaties beat state statutes, a holding that a carriage tax did not wreck the Constitution, a jury instruction that dared to empower laypeople, then quietly withdrew, a rejection of a Chief Justice for being too political in public, a resignation to go be a governor. a death in debt, a sense that fleas travel better than precedent. Each scene can be told with a smirk, but each one carried weight. Even the role of court reporters illustrates how institutions calcify. Dallas cobbled together 4 volumes from whatever crossed his desk. His successor, William Cranch, took over in 1801 and began to standardize reports. Eventually, the government paid the reporter and brought the process under some control. The practice of citing cases by the reporter's name survived as a historical echo. Dallas's reports, Cranch's reports, Wheaton's, Peters, until the official United States reports, numbering absorbed them. The Supreme Court's memory went from private pamphlets to public canon over several decades. The stone tablets arrived after the first generation had already set down their notes in ink. Those notes narrate how a ragged court matured. The justices, without life tenure's psychological safety net fully tested, still behaved as if they had nothing to fear but the law. They said no to the president when they had to. They said no to the states and endured the answer back in the form of an amendment. They said yes to riding into towns that barely had roads. They said yes to upholding taxes, treaties, and maritime law, even when doing so made them unpopular at home. They said yes to a national judiciary even when their own bodies were saying no. The forgotten story of the first Supreme Court doubles as a reminder about institutions that grow stronger by restraint. The court did not demand a palace. It borrowed a room. It did not announce that it held judicial review. It exercised judgment, case by case. It did not pretend to be above politics. It stumbled through politics with more principle than glamour. It risked humiliation. It lost members. It survived. The biographies of Jay, Ellsworth, Wilson, Iredell, Cushing, Rutledge, Johnson, Patterson, and Chase read like miniature founding myths themselves, filled with courage and folly. Together, they tell how a court without an audience earned a reputation that would make an audience lean in. The landscape changed at the turn of the century. The federal capital moved to the banks of the Potomac. In 1800, the justices unpacked in the Capitol. The Judiciary Act of 1801 offered them relief and the chance to stop riding circuit. The election flipped, the Relief Act vanished, and the justices headed back to the road. Then the court took a deep breath, heard Marbury, and enshrined judicial review in a single headline line. That breath pulled in 10 years of oxygen. The first court had filled the room with it. Modern readers love a neat arc, and the early court resists that. The arc bends in strange ways. It bends through a jury instruction about power to judge law and facts that looks radical from a 21st century vantage point, bends through a sovereign immunity decision that triggered a constitutional amendment within 2 years. It bends through a chief justice who became governor, another who became a diplomat, another who never took office despite confirmation, and an associate who got rejected for the top job because he gave a speech. The arc bends over roads of mud that made even hardened men write home about insects. It bends toward the rule of law anyway. Behind every bending line sits a text. The Constitution's Article 3 gave the court original jurisdiction over cases affecting ambassadors, public ministers, and consuls, and those in which a state is a party, and appellate jurisdiction in other enumerated categories, with exceptions and regulations set by Congress. The Judiciary Act of 1789 translated that into a living structure. Section 13 of that act granted the court the power to issue writs of mandamus in cases warranted by the principles and usages of law, a provision that collided with Article 3 in Marbury. Section 25 granted review over state court decisions involving federal law the spring that powered the supremacy of federal law over state law in practice. The first court proved that words on parchment only breathe when someone inhales them. The inhale looked unglamorous. It sounded like hoofbeats, facts that sound like punchlines stick because they reveal something sharp. James Wilson, a justice, got jailed for debt in Burlington, New Jersey in 1796. A Supreme Court justice in a debtor's prison during the 1790s tells an audience more about the young republic's unforgiving capital markets than 1,000 lectures on economic history. John Rutledge, once a star of the founding generation, stood on a Charleston wharf in 1795 and denounced a treaty negotiated by his former colleague, then watched the Senate vote him off the island. The Supreme Court, much later framed as the apex of decorum, began as a workplace populated by human beings with thin skin and loud voices. That humanity complicates the myth and improves the memory. The early Supreme Court also offered a running commentary on American sovereignty. In prize and admiralty cases, like Glass v. the sloop Betsy, the court told foreign powers that tribunals set up on American soil without congressional authorization had no jurisdiction over captures. In cases about foreign ministers and consuls, the court asserted original jurisdiction, making the point that the law of nations would run through American forums when American soil and interests were involved. These decisions contributed to neutrality policy, while the country tried to avoid getting crushed between Britain and France. They also aligned with Washington's sobriety, anchoring foreign policy partly in courts rather than in street protests or proclamations alone. Under Ellsworth, the court functioned while the Chief Justice was at sea. He left in October 1799 for France and returned broken, resigning in December 1800. During his absence, the court did not collapse. William Patterson, a practical jurist with a feel for statute, kept the lights on. The law did not depend on one man. Not even then. The first court, despite personalities, operated collegially. That collegiality contrasted beautifully with the madhouse of Congress's party wars in the late 1790s over the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Quasi War, and the election fireworks. The court's calm between storms deserves its own footnote. It also deserves a correction of another modern exaggeration. The Supreme Court did not spend its first decade muscling states into submission. Where v. Hilton enforced a treaty. The 11th Amendment respected sovereign immunity beyond Chisholm. The court understood that it sat atop a pyramid, held up by state courts. State judges ran criminal trials, probate, property disputes, and most civil litigation. The court spoke sparingly and kept one eye on political weather. The institution that exists today can afford to be bolder because the culture accepts judicial review. The institution then played a different game. It spoke when required and stared down its shoes when silence served a republic better. The first Supreme Court belongs to an America that people often forget existed. It was a scattered nation of 3.9 million people in 1790, with about 700,000 enslaved. It had 31 post offices. Roads were so primitive that some routes from Boston to New York could become impassable for days. The Treasury and War Departments occupied more mindshare than any court. The court functioned anyway. That functioning built muscles for the showdown in 1803, when Marshall would say that the laws of Congress cannot alter the Constitution. Without the earlier proofs, that sentence might have sounded like a revolutionary slogan. With the proofs, it felt like the closing argument. Any story about the first Supreme Court, told honestly, mixes reverence with a grin. The 6-member bench that opened in 1790 had to invent everything. Dress codes, bar admissions, rules of practice, a messenger system, a public persona. It ruled on the constitutionality of a tax on carriages before it ruled on its own front-page legissimus. It did a little bit of international law, a little bit of debt collection, a little bit of maritime policy, a little bit of constitutional theory, a lot of travel, and an occasional near-death experience on the highway. It got a man rejected for chief judgeship because of a speech, and another man jailed for debt. It told the president no. It told the states yes, then no, then yes again, depending on the case and the clause. It did not demand adoration. It earned it later. That later respect soaks backward, making the early court look inevitable. The better view sees contingency. The Senate could have approved Rutledge. He could have led the court into a different style. The 11th Amendment could have failed. Sovereign immunity law could look profoundly different. Hamilton could have lost in Ware v. Hilton, with state statutes squeezing out the Treaty of Paris. The carriage tax could have fallen, crippling Congress's early revenue. Washington could have received advisory opinions and turned federal courts into an anteroom for the cabinet. Each of those roads existed. The first court took a different path. That path looks narrow because they had to hack it out of the wilderness. The wilderness has markers. The Judiciary Act of 1789 and its amendments, including those in 1793 and 1797. The Invalid Pensions Act of 1792 and the letters in Hayburn's case. The Neutrality Proclamation of April 22nd, 1793, and the refusal to comment. The 11th Amendment's proposal in March 1794 and ratification in February 1795. The Jay Treaty's ratification by a 2010 Senate vote in June 1795. The 1796 cluster of Hilton and Ware. The 1798 moment in Calder. The Judiciary Act of 1801 and its repeal in 1802. Each date pegs the narrative to something verifiable. The sources sit in the Dallas reports, in the official Supreme Court histories, in Federalist essays, in congressional records. The paper trail exists even when the drama is small. The picture that emerges looks surprisingly modern. The early court saw itself as an interpreter, not an inventor, of law. It guarded the boundaries of its function. It refused to be baited into politics even while drowning in it. It performed seriousness on a shoestring. It valued process. It wore simple robes and preferred to let argument do the work. It accepted that the people would not fall in love with it. It cultivated something sturdier than love. It cultivated habit. Habit matters. A habit of writing opinions builds reliance. A habit of showing up creates gravity. A habit of declining advisory opinions blocks political exploitation. A habit of circuit riding, miserable as it was, connected the court to places where federal power lived or died. A habit of legalism moderated the ideological wars of the 1790s. From those habits, institutional dignity grew. That dignity survived a century of crises and 2 centuries of controversy. The origin story contains no immaculate conception. It contains a desk in a borrowed room, a judge on a horse, a letter refusing to answer, a terse paragraph dismissing a case on a technicality, a treaty treated as law, a tax upheld, a state told yes and then told no, and a nation slowly realizing that words can govern. The forgotten story ends the moment the court steps into Washington, D.C., and John Marshall begins to carve sentences into the American brain. It ends. But it does not vanish. Every time the court cites Ware for treaty supremacy, Hilton for tax definitions, Calder for tax definitions, Calder for ex post facto limits, every time it refuses to render an advisory opinion, the spirit of that first decade gets another breath. The court that began with no cases, no building, and no aura, now sits in a marble hall with friezes of lawgivers and a calendar that churns. The continuity between the flea-ridden ride from Richmond to Savannah and a clerk filing a cert petition in a gleaming edifice is not mystical. It is institutional. The first American Supreme Court did not look supreme. It looked human. That is the strongest argument for how it became powerful. It earned power in public by surviving mistakes, by insisting on rules, and by doing dull things well. Every nail it hammered in those years held something in place that needed to stay put. The judiciary did not fall in love with its own image. It built one slowly. People forgot the fleas. They remembered the law. Moving on, our next tale is titled Most Disturbing Sexual Practices of Ancient Rome. Rome loved marble, law, and the illusion that everything was under control. Under the polished surface, the rules of sex followed one law above all: power. Not love, not consent, not romance. Power. A Roman of rank measured life by who controlled whom. And the bedroom was just another arena for domination. That is where things get disturbing, fast. Imagine the city in the 1st century C. The smell of garum in the streets and the clatter of wooden carts echo from dawn until late. On the walls of bars and bathhouses, graffiti shouts, names, boasts, and crude jokes. Inside the law courts, men in clean togas debate adultery and morals with straight faces, then head home to houses where the staff can't say no. A Roman moralist would talk all day about virtue and then wink and move on. The contradictions weren't bugs in the system. They were the system. Start with the basic wiring of Roman sexuality. The active partner dominated. The passive partner was dominated. That single idea drove everything. The key variables were status and citizenship. A freeborn Roman male could be socially praised for penetrating a partner of lower status, slave, prostitute, or entertainer, and condemned if he took the passive role, especially with another male. The language shows it. Words like pathicus and synedus, loaded, ugly slurs in Latin, meant not gay, but effeminate, unmanly, and were used to imply political weakness. Roman masculinity wasn't about orientation. It was about hierarchy. That framework soaked into the laws, the jokes, the wardrobes, and even the taxes. The most disturbing reality sat in every elite household. Slavery. Sexual access to enslaved people was routine, legal, and expected. Roman jurists in the Digest, compiled in the 6th century, but quoting earlier imperial era law, treat the sexual use of slaves as a property matter. Ulpian and Paul discuss rape in terms that prioritize the status of the person violated. Assaulting a free citizen was a public crime. Assaulting a slave was damage to someone's property unless extreme violence was involved. No courtroom stagecraft about honor when the victim was owned. The moral math was cold. Inside wealthy homes, deliciae and pueri, delicati, terms for favorite youth or prettified boy slaves, appear in poetry and satire. Statius, Sylvae 3.4, writes about Erinus, the eunuch beloved by Emperor Domitian, in tones that sound like a court poem and a nervous justification at the same time. Martial celebrates Erinus too, describing the dedication of his hair to Aesculapius. These poets weren't drafting law, but they were capturing an atmosphere. Castration wasn't a Roman invention, and Roman law eventually moved against it. Under Hadrian in the 2nd century C, castration became clearly punishable. Digest 48.8, and earlier emperors, including Domitian, had pushed to restrict the practice. The ban itself reveals the demand. Eunuchs did not appear by accident. They were made for pleasure and control. The city's commercial sex industry made the same dynamics public. In Pompeii, the Lupana, the best-preserved brothel, still stands. 10 cubicles, a narrow central corridor, stone beds that demanded a cushion, and frescoes above the doorways advertising positions. Like a grim menu, prices scratched in graffiti suggest fees as low as 2 asses for the basics. To translate the economy, a legionary's official pay under Augustus sat at 225 denarii per year, which breaks down to roughly 10 to 12 asses a day. 2 asses for sex equaled a fraction of a soldier's daily wage. The system priced bodies like fast food. Suetonius notes that Caligula revived and expanded a tax on prostitution. Caligula 40-41, collecting revenue from the earnings of sex workers and even taxing their clients. Rome found a way to turn exploitation into a line item on the imperial budget. Coins with explicit imagery, known today as spintrii, muddy the waters further. They show numbered sexual scenes and date to the reign of Tiberius, or slightly later. For a long time, popular law claimed they were brothel tokens used to avoid speaking services out loud, or to avoid bringing the emperor's image into a brothel. Modern numismatists debate their purpose: gaming pieces, bathhouse checks, or some other token. But even if they weren't brothel currency, their existence proves the commercialized, transactional way Romans treated sex. It's not erotic art. It's a ledger with bodies. Arguments about Roman orgies show how myth competes with reality. Banquets could be wild, and sources like Petronius's Satyricon mock the vulgarity of nouveau riche party hosts in the 60s. But the famous vomitorium wasn't a puke room. The term refers to passages in amphitheaters that spew out the crowd. Romans really did vomit at feasts sometimes, and they really did import expensive delicacies and hire entertainers who doubled as sex workers. But the idea of constant city-wide orgy is mostly later fantasy. Roman decadence was less a swirling orgy and more a bureaucracy of exploitation, tracked by taxes and moral laws. Those moral laws got muscular under Augustus. In De Soto Bar, he launched the Lex Julia Dei Adulterius Coercendis and the Lex Julia Dei Maritandis Ordinibus, with more tweaks under the Lex Papia Popia of Novse. Adultery became a public crime. A father could kill a daughter's lover if he caught them in his house. A husband couldn't legally kill his wife but had to divorce her and prosecute, or risk being charged himself for leniency. Penalties included exile and confiscation of half a man's property and a third of a woman's. Senators and their descendants faced bans on marrying freed women or prostitutes. Suetonius, Augustus 34, brags about Augustus's moral renovation of Rome. He also records the imperial hypocrisy. Augustus exiled his own daughter Julia in 2 Bs for sexual misconduct, and later his granddaughter, blaming them under the same laws he created. Public virtue, private calamity. Rome specialized in that combination. That obsession with sexual control extended to the Vestal virgins. These priestesses of Vesta took a 30-year vow of chastity. When a Vestal broke it, or was judged to have broken it, she was buried alive in a chamber near the Colline Gate, given a lamp and minimal food, because Romans couldn't legally spill a Vestal's blood. The lover was flogged to death. Domitian, the same emperor with the eunuch favorite, convicted multiple Vestals in 83, some say unjustly, and oversaw at least one live burial. Suetonius, Domitian 8. Pliny the Younger. Letters 4.1 hints at the climate of fear. The ritualized horror of the execution reinforced the message. Women's sexuality, when linked to sacred duty, would be controlled with terrifying spectacle. Control in Rome also wrapped itself in rumor, and sexually charged scandal worked as political acid. Suetonius claims Tiberius on Capri trained children to perform intimate acts in his privately engineered pools, and nicknamed them Minnows. Tiberius 44. The tale drips with moral disgust, and maybe a little tabloid flair. Even if only partly true, it shows what counted as an accusation. Caligula allegedly slept with his sisters and paraded his mistresses as empresses. Suetonius, Caligula 24:36. Nero married the castrated Sporus in a public ceremony, veiled the youth like a bride, called him Sabina, after his deceased wife Poppaea Sabina, and paraded him in a litter with imperial attendants. Suetonius, Nero 28. Cassius Dio 63, 3.13. Nero also married a freedman named Pythagoras, this time taking the role of the bride himself in a ridiculous reversal, staged for shock. Tacitus, Annals 15.37. Each case displays not romance, but the use of sex, real, staged, or rumored to mesmerize and humiliate. A Roman historian weaponized sexual scandal to paint a ruler as unfit. The worse the story, the more satisfying the takedown. In the arena, the line between entertainment and cruelty blurred. Martial's De Spectaculis celebrates a spectacle where a criminal playing Orpheus is mauled and mentions mythological punishments adapted for execution. Later Christian authors, including Tertullian, Apologeticus 15, describe arena deaths with sexualized costumes and humiliations. A man dressed as Pasiphae, another as Attis, a woman as Europa. Scholars debate how far the sexual component went. Ancient rumor loved to insist on mechanical bulls and forced couplings with animals. The safest ground. Sometimes the state executed criminals by staging myth scenes with erotic overtones for audience shock. The point was degradation before death. Even when the stories exaggerate, they reveal the appetite of spectators and the brutality of the state. At the household level, Roman marriage could start shockingly early. The legal minimum age was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Many elite brides married in the mid-teens to men, a decade or two older. Roman writers like Musonius Rufus and Soranus of Ephesus advised against early childbirth for health reasons, which shows that people noticed the cost. The law did not. The Lex Papia Poppaea incentivized children with tax benefits and career perks. Family strategy trumped adolescence. Infant exposure amplified that calculation. Across the Roman world, unwanted babies, often girls, were left out to die or be picked up by strangers. A papyrus from Roman Egypt, the famous letter of Hilarion to his wife Alice, c. 1 Bess, instructs that if the baby is male, keep it. If female, expose it. The letter is Greek in language, but Roman in date and social world. Exposure was not a legal execution. It was a family decision, fueled by poverty, shame, or preference. Foundlings could be raised as slaves. If the origin point was an assault or a pregnancy that threatened a marriage arrangement, exposure solved the problem for the adults and created a lifetime of vulnerability for the child. The sexual economy started early. Prostitution formed the public face of that economy. Brothels, of which Pompeii gives a snapshot, sat close to baths and inns. Sex workers registered with the aediles in theory, and the law branded them infames, people of tainted status, alongside actors and gladiators. Juvenal rolls his eyes at toegate prostitutes, women who, by wearing the male garment in satire, symbolically lost the veil of modesty. Satire 2.65. Marriage laws barred senators and their descendants from marrying those marked as infames. That classification functioned like a permanent scarlet letter sewn to legal identity. The business itself was varied. Some sex workers were enslaved and controlled by a pimp, Leno or Lena. Others were freelancers renting a room. Prices in Pompeian graffiti range from 2 to 8 asses for common services. The number becomes more chilling when compared to the cost of bread or wine, and the fact that the person on the other side of the transaction had few options. When Romans weren't buying sex, they were regulating it with curses. The Roman world loved magic. Lead curse tablets, defictiones, turn up all over the empire. Many focused on desire or sexual control. A typical tablet binds a person's body and mind, compelling them to burn with longing. The formulas drip with obsession and coercion. At Bath in Britain, at Hadrumetum in North Africa, at Rome and Naples, these tablets, scratched in tiny letters, folded and nailed, try to make other people into puppets. They provide an X-ray of Roman intimacy. Possessive, transactional, fearful of rivals, eager to weaponize the gods for private hunger. Another behavior that complicates the picture of Roman liberty. Mixed bathing. Some bath complexes allowed men and women in together at certain hours, especially during the early imperial period. Seneca the Younger grumbled about the noise and the indecency. Pliny the Elder insisted that women should bathe separately. Hadrian reportedly banned mixed bathing outside families. The pendulum swung with emperors and local practice. In a society where honor depended on public modesty, especially for free-born women, the baths tested the boundaries. The existence of the debate shows anxiety. Pleasure was acceptable, but visibility had to be managed. Roman satire opens another window. Juvenal's sixth satire is a sneer at elite women's morals, obsessed with cuckoldry, love potions, and gladiator mania. The famous story of Epia, a senator's wife who runs off with a gladiator with a scarred face and bad breath, comes loaded with disdain. Whether she existed or not matters less than what the story signals. Women craving the hypermasculine spectacle of the arena, breaking class rules for raw physicality. Other graffiti in Pompeii praises specific gladiators as heartthrobs. One scratched line: Crescens the net fighter delights the girls, turns athletes into sex symbols, and tells a truth about celebrity fandom that feels modern. The disturbing edge is how quickly fascination slides into objectification, and how often violence sits next to desire, literally separated by a railing in the amphitheater. Male-male sex, again, sits on status rails rather than identity categories. A freeborn adult male could penetrate a male slave or a prostitute without social ruin. If he wanted to be penetrated, he risked public shame and political ruin. The law known as the Lex Scantinia, its exact date and details are foggy, probably late Republican, reportedly punished stuprum with freeborn male minors, possibly also adult freeborn men who were passive. Cicero and Juvenal reference it obliquely. The law's vagueness in the record is almost as telling as its existence. It mattered who was protected, freeborn male citizens, and who was not, slaves, entertainers, prostitutes. Consent doesn't appear as the hinge of the crime. Status does. When modern readers search for sexuality, the Romans offer a grim reminder that their moral compass pointed to hierarchy. Incest accusations functioned as reputation. Napalm. Suetonius repeats stories of Caligula's incest with his sisters, claiming he took Drusilla's virginity, made her his de facto wife, and mourned her as a spouse when she died in 38 C. Whether that was true or a smear designed to mark him as beyond the pale, the charge harnessed disgust as a political weapon. Claudius, more legally, married his niece Agrippina, the younger, in 49 C, and passed a special senatorial decree to permit uncle-niece marriage. Roman law allowed some such marriages in particular circumstances, but public unease remained. Rumors also swirled around Nero and his mother, Agrippina. Allegations of incest used to paint Nero's whole court as corrupted. Ancient sources like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio don't hide their biases, and a wise reader treats their more lurid details as part reportage, part rhetorical assassination. The Bacchanalia affair in 186 Beth shows a society panicking over who controlled ritual and sex. Livy's account, Book 39, describes the Bacchic cult in Rome as a front for massive nocturnal revels, fraud, and sexual exploitation, with freeborn men and women being assaulted in the frenzy. The Senate responded with a famous decree, the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, preserved on bronze from Tiriolo in southern Italy, which banned the uncontrolled cult and demanded prior authorization for any Bacchic meeting. Livy certainly sensationalizes, but Roman lawmakers didn't care about nuance. They saw gatherings. They didn't control. They imagined sex outside elite control. They cracked down. The decree is a masterclass in how moral panic functions. Sex, secrecy, and fear of social mixing become reasons to bring the hammer down. On the domestic front, contraception and abortion were real, hazardous, and unemotional by modern standards. Cyrus of Ephesus, in the 2nd century CE, wrote a gynecological treatise recommending pessaries and cautioning against dangerous methods. Pliny the Elder talked about plants used as contraceptives or abortifacients with an encyclopedist's indifference. The legendary plant Silphium from North Africa near Cyrene was valued for many properties, including pregnancy prevention. Pliny claims the last stalk was presented to Nero, Natural History 19.38, an anecdote that reads like a parable about appetite consuming its own supply. Whether or not that last stalk story holds exact truth, the larger pattern stands. Romans treated pregnancy as both a family strategy and a medical problem, and they regulated women's bodies accordingly. Even sexual insults had civic weight. Cicero's speeches call enemies parthesi and synonady, not clinical descriptions, but slurs designed to say, this man is unfit to rule. Catullus drops obscene invective to brand rivals as predators or submissives. The legal and social weight stacked heavily on the receptive role. A politician could boast about passive women and subordinate partners all day and remain a pillar of the state if his opponents convinced the public that he enjoyed being on the receiving end. His career could evaporate. Sex here is not about bedrooms. It is a constitutional principle. Public penalties matched the rhetoric with theatre. Adulterous women, after Augustus faced exile to bleak islands, like Julia the Elder's banishment to Pandateria. The father's right to kill a seducer caught in flagranti in his own house. Dramatized patriarchal control. Outside the imperial family, lesser-known punishments could be even more degrading. A woman convicted of adultery might be forced to wear a certain dress or have her dowry confiscated. Men could be barred from holding office. The state brand worked like a tattoo across a family's alliances for decades. The baths, again, offered what looked like equal pleasure, but social rules stayed lopsided. Freeborn women sometimes frequented baths at specific hours. Enslaved attendants assisted. Roman writers occasionally mention prostitutes plying their trade near bathhouses, blending leisure and business. In daily practice, visibility and respectability governed female bodies far more closely than male ones. A woman's modesty lived on her skin, and bathing time had to be negotiated around it. Theatre and mimes often performed explicit scenes on stage. The mime was a low-status form, despised by moralists and adored by crowds. Augustus himself, it is worth repeating, tried to restrain performers with laws and moral scolding. Tiberius expelled actors from Rome at various points for causing riots. Yet, sexual content thrived in the popular stage because the audience wanted it. Once again, the rule emerges. High culture disapproved, low culture shouted, and the empire profited either way. When emperors performed, the wiring shorted out. Nero competed in Greek-style musical contests and staged weddings that flipped gender roles in ways designed to shock and dominate the news cycle of 64 to 67. Cassius Dio describes Nero in The Bridal Veil, marrying Pythagoras, while Tacitus reports the marriage rituals with a tone pitched between outrage and disbelief. The message Nero broadcast was simple. The emperor makes the rules and the spectacle. That may be the most Roman element of all, using sex as a theatre of sovereignty. Elagabalus, ruling 218 to 222 C as a teenager, became the late empire's lightning rod for sexual scandal. Ancient accounts by Cassius Dio, Book 80, Herodian, Book 5, and the notoriously unreliable Historia Augusta paint him as a chaos machine. Married multiple times, including to a Vestal virgin, offered rewards to doctors to create a physical change, so he could be penetrated without pain. Hosted dinner parties with shocking amusements. The picture comes filtered through intense hostility to a foreign deity and a youth who didn't play by Rome's unspoken rules. Strip away the propaganda, and Elagabalus still tore through boundaries with gusto. Romans read it as an emperor, letting private appetites dictate public life. Ancient writers turned it into a cautionary tale with explicit colors, a separate practice that makes stomachs knot. The murder of sexual assault victims to protect family honor. Roman law technically punished rape, violent stuprum against freeborn persons, but families sometimes chose to erase shame with another crime. Stories appear of victims forced to suicide or quietly killed by relatives. Poets and historians mention hushed-up tragedies as warnings about reputation. The reality lurks between the lines. Social pressure taught that assault damaged a family brand more than the attacker's guilt. That mindset didn't disappear with constitutions or conquests. It needed a slow revolution of attitudes that Rome never attempted. Marital power imbalances structured everyday life too. In older forms of marriage, a wife came under the legal hand, manus, of her husband or his father. By the late Republic, many elite marriages shifted to a freer arrangement where the wife remained under her father's legal control, sign manu, giving her more independence in property. The social script remained patriarchal. Husbands could take sexual access to slaves for granted, and wives were expected to shrug and carry on. Female adultery was a crime. Male adultery could be a punchline. The double standard was so normal that satire barely noticed it. Evidence scratched on Pompeian walls adds detail to the club of ancient hypocrisy. The corpus of Pompeian graffiti includes around 11,000 texts, Sil Ive. They cover political slogans, notes about lost items, jokes, insults, and sexual boasts. They show the voices of sailors, soldiers, innkeepers, and anonymous flirts. The sexual lines read today like blunt force. They read then like banter. Visitors today hear the echoes and see a culture that put private things in public in a way that breaks modern filters, a society that didn't blink at slavery, didn't blink at sexual graffiti either. Augustus's moral revolution wasn't the only legislative theatre. Claudius entangled family law by legalizing the uncle-niece marriage he wanted to make, then saw it used against his reputation forever. The emperors loved to legislate bodies. Constantine, later in the 4th century, began criminalizing certain same-sex acts between men with severe penalties, including burning in a Christianizing empire that wanted new moral yardsticks. The transformation wasn't a clean line from tolerant paganism to prudish Christianity. That modern story is too simple. It was a shift from status-based rules to sin-based rules, with different categories of harm and horror. The disturbing part remains constant. The state stamped its will on intimate life and declared it virtue. Sex could also function as evidence of national decline. Sallust, Livy, and later Tacitus blamed luxury and sexual license for Rome's drift from rustic virtue. Their nostalgia for an imagined moral past is familiar. By the time of Tacitus in the early 2nd century, the stories of Tiberius's Capri, Nero's fiddling, and Messalina's supposed sex marathon, claimed by Juvenal and others, probably invented, served as cultural shorthand. An empire that could devour nations could also devour its own dignity. The fact that some of those stories are demonstrably exaggerated does not erase their power. It proves how central sexual anxiety was to Roman political storytelling. Medicine and midwifery provide another angle. Cyrus's gynecology offers practical, non-moralizing advice on menstruation, fertility, contraception, and abortion, including recipes for pessaries and warnings against violent methods that harmed women. The medical marketplace sold hope. The fact that the doctor felt compelled to caution shows that women's bodies were being subjected to experimental, often dangerous practices to meet the demands of men, families, and law. Even when a writer sounds gentle, the reality behind the page involved pain, risk, and pressure. Household servants absorbed a different kind of pressure. The Roman word for a household manager, villicus or villicus, appears in farm manuals, laying out rules that included sexual access for masters and high expectations of sexual restraint for slaves. Cato the Elder, in the 2nd century described buying and selling slaves like tools and suggests strict discipline, including selling older slaves when they were no longer productive. One can read between the lines. A system that treats humans as assets licenses their bodies too. Archaeologists find shackles in the quarters of some villas. The bedroom had company. Even seemingly charming artifacts carry shadows. The little winged phalluses, Facina, found as amulets everywhere from Pompeii to the frontiers, weren't pornographic decorations. They were protective charms. Good luck against the evil eye. Yet, the ubiquity of the symbol shows a culture saturated in sexual imagery. A child might wear a phallic amulet to ward off harm. Protection and sexuality braided together in ways that today's world would split apart. The Romans didn't stitch modesty and innocence to childhood in the same way. That difference occasionally led to brutal outcomes when the powerful wanted to blur lines for their own pleasure. Consider the legal case of stuprum. This catch-all term covered illicit sex, not strictly adultery. Seducing a respectable unmarried woman, seducing a freeborn youth, corrupting a widow. The crime involved the dishonor of a guardian and a family, not the harm to an individual's autonomy. The Roman courtroom did not ask whether the person consented as the primary issue. It asked whether the right people had control. That is the cold logic that makes so many Roman practices feel monstrous now. The framework never centered the vulnerable. There is also the demon in the details. Forced prostitution as punishment. While not an everyday court sentence, ancient sources hint at moments when women of low status convicted of crimes could be penned into brothels or barred from decent work. Infamia haunted them forever. Meanwhile, men convicted of sexual crimes might face exile or a fine. The hierarchy of shame remained carefully stacked. Even urban planning gives away secrets. Brothels clustered near the Forum and baths in Pompeii. In Ostia, Rome's port, reliefs above shop fronts, advertised services with images of amphorae, ships, and sometimes suggestive scenes. A sex worker's place in the city was carved into the map. The stones record a logic deeper than a moral sermon. Sex sold, and the city hid it in plain sight. Roman religion mirrored that frankness. Fertility cults and festival days, like the Lupercalia in mid-February, included ritualized nudity and mock pursuits by men dressed in skins, striking women playfully, or not so playfully, with strips of hide to promote fertility. The rite predates the empire and carried mythic justifications. But in practice it made the female body a public target in the name of luck. The boundary between playful and coercive was crossed when the wrong men joined the run, or when a crowd decided that ritual consent excused roughness. Roman law liked ritual because it created control. Rituals, in turn, licensed behaviors that would otherwise be called harassment. The military had its own sexual economy. Soldiers were officially banned from legal marriage for much of the first 2 centuries, a rule gradually relaxed and finally abandoned, meaning many soldiers kept unofficial partners and children in camp towns. Prostitutes and camp followers trailed legions, and commanders looked the other way. The empire's engine marched on with a parallel shadow family structure and transactional sex orbiting every fort. A soldier's pay, again, gives the math. 225 denarii a year under Augustus, raised to 300 by Domitian. A cheap brothel visit at 2 asses took a sliver of that. The system was calibrated for affordability, and the supply was coerced. Language keeps returning as a clue. The standard Roman insult arsenal included calling a man an irrimator, someone who forced oral sex on others, an imposition coded as raw dominance. Sexual slurs were not only personal. They functioned as political labels and social maps. Who dominated? Who obeyed? The repeated use of those words in poetry, graffiti, and court speeches creates a background buzz of violence. Sex, in Latin, is often an act done to someone, not with someone. The household gods watched silently. The Lurarium at a Pompeian doorway shows little figures of ancestors and serpents of plenty. The same house might have a room explicitly decorated with erotic scenes. Romans compartmentalized. The home was a workshop of status. The dinner room displayed silver and learning. The cubicular rented to clients by the hour displayed price and availability. The staff moved through both worlds with a hand on their own throat to remind them to keep quiet. Roman law occasionally tried to carve out islands of protection. By late antiquity, emperors like Constantine and Theodosius began punishing rape of slaves more severely, at least on paper. Christian bishops thundered against brothels, though they thrived in cities. Late imperial law codes stack edicts on marriage, divorce, and sexual offenses with increasing detail. That development did not come from a sudden burst of empathy. It came from a changing vision of public order. The disturbing constant is that female chastity now belonged to God and husband as much as it had belonged to father and husband before. The controlling hands changed, not the impulse to control. The myths Romans told themselves reveal what kept them awake. The rape of the Sabine women, Livy's version of Rome's founding, describes the abduction of neighboring women by Romulus's men to populate the city, followed by a forced assimilation and eventual peace. It is a story Rome told as a national origin. The violence gets repackaged as destiny. Generations heard it as a civic fable, then went home to households run by the logic that made the fable acceptable. When the baseline of the national story is a mass abduction reframed as alliance, private abuses have a lot of cover. Finally, after centuries of triumph and trauma, the temple fires went out. In 394 C, Theodosius ended state support for pagan cults, and the Vestals dispersed. The Roman world did not become pure or gentle. It rebranded. Sexual practices became more hidden in public law and more shrouded in sin in the new cosmology. The same empire that once taxed sex now declared it wrong in more contexts. But the victims, the slaves, the minors, the powerless, stayed vulnerable until structures changed. Rome taught a hard lesson. Without a concept of individual consent, backed by real protections, sexual life becomes a theater for domination, whether the actors wear togas or tunics or crowns. The record that survives: Suetonius's scandal sheets, Tacitus's moral epics, Juvenal's snarls, the jurist's footnotes. The Pompeian graffiti forms a chorus that sometimes exaggerates and sometimes shrugs. Their contradictions are instructive. A Rome that could prosecute a noblewoman for adultery could ignore a slave's assault. A society that made a public ritual out of a vestal's chastity could pair it with emperors who staged gender-swapped weddings. The problem is not a lack of rules. It is the purpose of the rules. When sex enforces hierarchy, the disturbing practices pile up not at the fringes, but at the center. Consider the specific snapshots as a montage. The Luparnes 10 rooms and stone beds, frescoes that freeze human bodies into genres, graffiti counting out asses like coins for bread, the tax ledgers of Caligula, cataloguing sex by the unit as vectigal, turning bodies into revenue streams, the digest, with its arid precision, listing crimes and penalties and revealing in the margins who mattered under the law. Erinus's hair dedicated to the god of healing while his body testifies to mutilation for pleasure, a contradiction polished into a court poem by Statius and offered to Domitian like a gem. Nero's wedding veil, hiding a face everyone knew, held up for applause amid a Rome still burying Vestals alive. For breaking a vow, the empire's two moralities colliding in a single decade. Livy's bronze decree against the Bacchanalia, stamping out private ecstasy with public order, rooting out what the Senate feared most: gatherings without permission, sex without oversight, a folded lead tablet in a well, letters spelling a desperate desire to bind someone else's will, proof that passion and control can blend so completely they become a single spell. A phallic charm on a child's necklace, meant to shield against curses, proof that protection and sex were neighbors in the Roman mind. A household inventory listing 2 Syrian eunuchs, proof that someone in that house paid for the removal of someone else's future. A funeral inscription for a freedwoman who ran a tavern, hinting at the blurred line between commerce and coercion in a city where body and beer occupied the same address. An edict against castrators, declaring a moral limit after centuries of demand. Proof that even Rome could draw a line when the supply chain for pleasure became too repugnant to ignore. But wait, one more pivot that changes how the story lands. The more lurid imperial rumors, Tiberius with Minnaus, Messalina competing in brothels, Caligula turning the palace into a sex market, sound like tabloid fever. Historians read them with caution. Roman authors use sexual horror as a political tool. Still, strip away the salt and the core remains. A culture where the powerful expected sexual access as part of their office, a law that measured harm by status, and a society that squeezed entertainment, morality policy, and business out of the same raw material. The reality that lingers is not a carousel of orgies, but a system. Slavery made consent almost meaningless for a huge slice of the population. Laws like the Lex Wulia punished female sexuality to defend male honor. Tokens and taxes monetized the rest. Poets and satirists kept a running commentary, laughing at what couldn't be stopped. Even reforms that look protective, bans on castration, crackdowns on unlicensed cults, feel like adjustments to a machine, not a change in the machine's purpose. It ends with a hard truth, dressed in marble. Rome gave the world roads, aqueducts, law, language, and literature that still shape lives. It also left a record of sexual practices that are disturbing, not because they were exotic, but because they were ordinary. The brothel doorways were as common as bakeries. The whispers in the palace coexisted with the client lists on tavern walls. The fascination with gladiators moved crowds like modern celebrity culture, except that the line between attraction and blood was only a few steps wide. No invented villains needed. The facts carry the chill. Roman sexuality wasn't superhuman or monstrous by nature. It was human desire, plugged into a grid of hierarchy. Under that current, everything warped. Bodies became currency. Laws became weapons, and pleasure became proof of rank. The architect of that grid is visible in every paragraph of the sources. Whether they call it virtue or vice, the marble is still smooth. The shadows never left. Our journey through history continues with the expansion of the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great. Babylon collapses with a whisper, not a scream. On the 12th of October, 539 BS, while most cities fall with fire and fanfare, the biggest urban center in the ancient Near East quietly watches a foreign army walk in as if it had dinner reservations. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a clay tablet that reads like a very dry live bog, notes the moment without melodrama. A general named Ubari, the governor of Gutium, serving a man from the Iranian highlands, opens the gates. Days later, on the 29th of October, that Highlander arrives. His name is Cyrus, son of Cambyses. He strolls into Babylon with a plan, a brand, and a better pre-team than any conqueror in centuries. Here is the curveball. The people do not hate him. Priests from the great temple of Marduk practically wave welcome banners. Merchants quietly feel their pulse and realize that not being burned alive might be the start of a strong business quarter. Cyrus issues proclamations in the language of the land, Akkadian, calling himself king of the world and framing his conquest not as an invasion, but as a restoration of cosmic order. This is not a horn-blaring victory parade. This feels like a corporate takeover, complete with rebranding, stakeholder outreach, and a grace period for temple tax obligations. The ancient Near East has seen empires before, but it has not seen this. Cyrus the Great begins as a minor king from Anshan in 559 BS. Anshan sits in Elamite territory on the Iranian plateau, not exactly headline central in a world dominated by Assyrian wrecking balls and Babylonian iconography. He inherits a throne that is basically a foothill. The dreams he brings to that foothill would rival Everest. According to Achaemenid tradition, he descends from Achaemenes through Thespis, Cyrus I, and Cambyses I. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century birth, claims a royal sunset drama in which the Median king Astyages tries to destroy Cyrus at birth. That tale reads like a Netflix pitch. Cuneiform texts are less excited, more paperwork. They identify him as Cyrus, king of Anshan before anything else, a young ruler who treats titles like climbing holes and scales them in sequence. The myth-making starts early and never stops. Later writers and modern slogans try to credit Cyrus with inventing human rights. The Cyrus cylinder, a baked clay roll about 22 centimeters long, inscribed in Akkadian and found in Babylon in 1879, often gets presented as a kind of ancient rights charter. That part needs a respectful pause. The cylinder is a remarkable artifact. It records Cyrus explaining that Marduk, Babylon's chief god, chose him to bring peace, restore sanctuaries, and allowed displaced peoples to return to their homes along with their god's cult statues. It reads like a clean policy document. It is also imperial propaganda. It does not abolish slavery. It does not declare universal equality. It positions Cyrus as the better option than Nabonidus, the ousted Babylonian king who had irritated the priesthood by sidelining Marduk in favor of Sin, the moon god. Aimé Licourt and Pierre Briand, two historians who have spent careers analyzing Achaemenid power, emphasize the point. The cylinder shows an empire that understood messaging. It proves Cyrus's skill at getting conquered people to sign the guest book with a smile. That alone is revolutionary. Rewind to the first major pivot. Cyrus does not start by knocking on Babylon's door. He first turns on his overlord, the Median king Astyages, the top dog of Western Iran. The years 553 to 550 Bus dissolve into 3 years of revolt and rumors. Herodotus reports that the Median general Harpagus decides to betray Astyages, and suddenly the Media-Persia relationship looks less like a marriage and more like a divorce. The result is decisive. In 550 Bus, Cyrus seizes Ecbatana, the Median capital, and rolls the Media brand into Team Achaemenid. Later, Achaemenid inscriptions treat this as a family business reorganization rather than a takeover. The signal to the region stays clear. Northern Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau now answer to one center. Old Assyrian nightmares now have a new Persian face. Pasargadae rises from this victory. Cyrus builds a capital there with limestone blocks fitted so tightly they seem machine-cut, royal gardens lined with water channels, and a cross-country statement piece that becomes the template for Persian aesthetics. The word paradise later flows into Greek as paradisos from the old Iranian word for a walled garden. This is not just landscaping. This is a manifesto built in stone and water. The empire grows with gardens and with garrisons. Next target, Lydia. Croesus of Lydia rules western Anatolia from Sardis and swims in gold, at least in the mental image of everyone from Herodotus to the modern mind. Real money bags. Lydia has pioneered coinage under Aliates around 600 Bars with electrum, a natural gold-silver alloy. Croesus upgrades the system around 550 Bes, minting separate gold and silver coins with a lion and bull design and consistent weight standards. He has the kind of liquidity that brags without words. The Greek cities along the coast, from Phocaea to Miletus, orbit his influence. Cyrus walks west in 547 Bes and reshapes the map with momentum rather than brute force alone. He meets Croesus at Pteria, deep in Cappadocia, in what Herodotus calls a hard, indecisive fight. Winter approaches. Croesus retires to Sardis to regroup and call allies. Cyrus refuses the pause, follows him, and forces a showdown at Thimbra near Sardis in 546. Herodotus tells a story about Cyrus using camels to disrupt the Lydian cavalry, since horses dislike camel smell. Whether the camel gambit works exactly as described is debated by modern historians who study equine behavior and battlefield practicality. The core outcome stands. The Lydian cavalry fails to deliver the win. The Persians break Sardis after a short siege that Herodotus times at 14 days. Croesus is captured. The gold in Lydia meets Persian administration, and the coins keep moving under new managers. Persian authorities even restamp Croesus' high-quality coinage briefly before Darius I later introduces the famous gold derrick. The Ionian Greek cities do not simply switch flags. They resist. Harpagus, the same player who turned on Astyages according to Herodotus, conducts a systematic campaign along the Aegean coast, between roughly 545 and 540 B. He leans on sieges and forced resettlements. Phocaea flees en masse in ships to Corsica and elsewhere. Miletus negotiates. The Aegean islands feel Persian pressure and adjust trade policies accordingly. Greek poets mourn, exile, and sell boat tickets with verse. The empire spreads not like a plague, but like a new climate front, steady and impossible to ignore, south and east. See a slow Persian net tightening in the late 540s bets. Bactria, Arakashar, and Draniana come into the fold after fights and treaties. These are not headline engagements in our sources, but the logistical math is visible. To take Babylon in 539 bus, Cyrus needs Iran quiet behind him, and the northern approach is secured. He gets it. Babylon's fall looks deceptively simple. Nabonidus, who has ruled since 556 BES, spends long stretches in the oasis of Tama in Arabia. He neglects the New Year festival in Babylon, the Akitu, which requires the king's presence so the statue of Marduk can endorse his rule. In public view, priests notice, nobles notice, merchants notice. If a king cannot show up for sacred calendar events, bankers start making backup plans. Cyrus feeds this dissatisfaction by presenting himself as Marduk's appointed restorer. The Cyrus cylinder frames it bluntly. Marduk looked for a just ruler, found Cyrus, and ordered him to take Babylon without undue violence. The Nabonidus Chronicle confirms the ease of the final approach. Cyrus's general Ubara enters on the 12th of October, 539 BC. 3 weeks later, Cyrus enters in person. No apocalyptic destruction. The city's sprawling markets keep humming. The temples resume business. The empire changes hands with an efficiency that modern executives would envy. The pry machine moves immediately. Cyrus announces a policy that looks like mercy and functions as strategy. Temples across Babylonia and beyond get back their cult statues. Exiled communities receive permission to return to their homelands. Jewish leaders later record an imperial decree in 530 BC, authorizing the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. The Book of Ezra names Sheshbazzar and later Zerubbabel as key figures in that process. Isaiah 45 famously calls Cyrus anointed, a startling moment in the Hebrew Bible. The Persians do not care about being anointed in that sense, but they appreciate the energy. This is how to rule a polyglot empire. Let people worship their gods, let local elites retain dignity, tax the commerce, and keep the garrison stocked with reliable professionals. Administration under Cyrus does not yet look like the fully elaborated satrapy system of Darius I, but the outlines are visible. There is a Persian core of aristocrats tied by blood, marriage, and personal loyalty. There are local governors installed, where compliance needs watching. Tabulus in Sardis, followed by Mazares, and then Harpagus, Ubaru, then Gubaru. The names shift in the texts. In Babylonia, there is continuity of scribal culture. Aramaic expands as the working language of administration across the empire. Akkadian documents continue in Babylonia. Elamite persists in Iran. The great king cares less about linguistic uniformity and more about readable receipts. Clay tablets recorded by scribes in local scripts can be read by the correct tax officials. Merchants understand the message instantly. The Persian army in Cyrus's day builds a reputation that precedes battle. The famous immortals, a 10,000 strong elite infantry, as described by Herodotus, likely exist in some form by the later 6th century BC, though the exact establishment and the name's accuracy have scholarly caveats. What is clear is the Persian preference for a combined arms force of archers, spearmen, and cavalry, all moving with speed and a terrifying rhythm. Persian infantry, often in quilted tunics with wicker shields, stabilizes the line while archers darken the sky. Cavalry, both Medes and Persians, flanks and finishes. The empire recruits widely. Scythians and Bactrians ride in. Lydian cavalry adapts. Ionian sailors hug Persian harbours. The logistical art behind this looks almost boring until one imagines carts creaking over the Iranian plateau, fodder supplies tracked like stocks, and a chain of way stations that keeps the army breathing. The royal road from Sardis to Susa gets its monumental identity under Darius, but Cyrus's teams already improve routes with milestones and wells. Communication with speed is power, and the Persians grasp it early. Cyrus' ideology, or the perception of it, adds a gloss that later empires envy. He never claims to abolish death or taxes. He presents himself as a restorer of order. On the Cyrus cylinder, he calls himself King of the Four Quarters, a phrase with deep Mesopotamian resonance. He taps into a tradition rather than inventing a new language of domination. In Iran, religion around this time is in flux. Later Persian kings like Darius and Xerxes carve inscriptions invoking Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrian tradition, and emphasize Arta, the cosmic truth or order. Cyrus leaves less explicit theological messaging in stone. Greek and later sources sometimes label Persian kings as Zoroastrians, but the 6th century religious landscape is more complex. What can be said safely is that under Cyrus, Persian rule favors temple sanctuaries with resources, the protection of cults, and the regular flow of offerings and taxes. Not a bad formula for stability. Then the narrative jolts north. Around 530 BC, Cyrus campaigns in Central Asia against tribes beyond the northeastern frontier. Herodotus tells the gripping Tomyris tale. In it, Cyrus fights the Massagetae, a formidable nomadic confederation under a queen. In that story, the Persians set a trap with feasts and wine. Tomyris' son falls for it, dies, and Tomyris defeats Cyrus in a revenge battle. She supposedly plunges his severed head into a skin of blood and delivers a lime bitter enough to age wood. That image sticks like a tattoo. Stesius, a Greek doctor at the Persian court, offers a different version in which Cyrus dies fighting the Derbices, aided by Indian elephants. Xenophon, the philosopher-soldier, writes a romanticized biography, the Cyropedia, where Cyrus dies peacefully. Modern historians read all these with squinted eyes. There is no cuneiform tablet that handholds the exact cause. The most responsible summary is cautious and sharp. Cyrus dies in the east in 530 BC in a campaign against nomadic or semi-nomadic groups. The location likely lies near the Seir Daria, once called the Jaxartes. He is succeeded by his son Cambyses. In Taf, the empire does not crumble. It absorbs the shock and continues. His body returns to Pasargadae, the place of first victory. The tomb is unlike anything else in the region. A stepped limestone structure with a gabled roof, severe and graceful. Arrian and Strabo repeat an inscription they say once stood near it. I am Cyrus, the king, and Achaemen. That sentence reads like a mic drop. Centuries later, in 330 bars, Alexander the Great will visit the tomb, secure the site after thieves loot it, and honor Cyrus as a model ruler. A conqueror respects a conqueror. Pasargadae's ruins still sit under the wide Iranian sky, the garden channels dry, the mountain horizon indifferent, and the tomb impossible to ignore. The scale of Cyrus's empire at his death is enormous for the age. From the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the foothills of the Hindu Kush. From the edge of Egypt's pole to the lines of the Seir Daria, a single authority collects taxes, deploys armies, and arbitrates local affairs. Precise area estimates are always slippery for ancient empires, but a conservative modern range for the domain under Cyrus falls in the millions of square kilometers, likely around 3 to 4 million, before Cambyses adds Egypt in 525 BS. The Achaemenid imperial machine will eventually stretch over roughly 5.5 million square kilometers at its wax, the largest polity the world has seen by population and area up to that time. Cyrus sets that machine on the road. The myths cling tight because they carry emotion. Cyrus the liberator who frees the Jews and writes a rights charter sounds like a humane emperor in a world of iron. That reputation is deserved in part and misleading in part. He does not dismantle empire. He builds the most effective one yet. He uses mercy as method. He restores temples because priests stabilize regions. He allows exiles to return because grateful communities do not plot revolt. On day one, he frames his rule in the language of gods that locals understand, because Persian and Elamite are not enough to run Babylon. The Cyrus cylinder does not invent rights. It reveals a playbook for multi-ethnic governance. That playbook outlives him. The contrast with the Neo-Assyrian Empire remains the cleanest statement of what he changes. Assyrian kings like Ashurbanipal do collect stunning libraries and commission art that still shakes museum floors. They also stage mass deportations and brag about flaying rebels. Their ethos says terror, then taxes. Cyrus chooses integration, then taxes. The Assyrian model burns too hot and collapses in 612 BS, with Nineveh's fall. The Persian model lasts 2 centuries, from 550 to 330 BS, even after internal crises and civil wars. That comparison has less romance than the world's first human rights slogan, and more explanatory power. Cyrus's expansion rolls on realistic rails. The map does not unfold in a single sprint. The steps are incremental, strategic, and well-timed. 559 BS. He takes Anshan and consolidates Persian tribes. 553. 550 BS. He knocks over Median, partners with Median elite, and claims their legacy. 547. 546 BS. He crushes Lydia, takes Sardis, and inherits coin-based capitalism that he uses without pretending to invent it. 540 BS. He kneads Western Asia Minor into empire through a general named Harpagus, a man who turns rebellious cities into Persian ports with patient brutality. 539 BS. He takes Babylon through an operation that looks bold and subtle at once, supported by a chorus of Babylonian tablets that note the dates and keep the drama contained. 538 BS onward. He issues decrees that allow and encourage displaced peoples to return and temples to rebuild. Around 530 BS, he dies fighting on the frontier, the edge of empire where horses shiver and grasslands run flat to the horizon. The mechanics beneath the map matter. Cyrus pushes a simple rule that feels modern in its bones. Centralized policy, localized execution. He plants Persian supervisors but keeps local notables in their seats if they cooperate. Satraps, the provincial governors whose full system belongs to Darius, are already appearing as appointed guardians. They command garrisons, collect tribute, and pass orders along a chain that relies on riders and relay stations. The empire does not build one language of administration from scratch. It speaks many. Akkadian scribes keep writing their tablets. Aramaic spreads because it fits quills and speed. Elamite keeps court memory alive. in Iran. Old Persian cuneiform barely exists under Cyrus. Darius will carve it deep into mountain faces later. Writing is the empire's bloodstream. Military reform under Cyrus is practical, not philosophical. The Persian spear is not the Macedonian sarissa with its impossible reach. The Persian wicker shield is not the bronze wall of a Greek hoplite phalanx. Different tools for a different doctrine. Persian infantry fights in dense formations with sparabara, shield and spearmen backed by archers, creating zones of death at mid-range. Cavalry does the decisive work. Median horsemen, in particular, carry weight. The empire invests in horses, like a modern power invests in satellites. Supply lines feed them. Garrisons keep them. Hunter peoples with composite bows become imperial. Their skills turned into salary and status. Cyrus also understands walls, rivers, and engineering like a man who sees a landscape as a puzzle. Herodotus delivers the story of Cyrus redirecting the Ganges River after it swept away a sacred horse, cutting it into 360 channels to humbled trickle status. That tale probably packages Persian hydrological prowess into a fable. The Babylon operation includes a tactic even skeptics find plausible. Lower the Euphrates at the right moment, use the riverbed, overwhelm the defenses where guards expect water, not soldiers. The chronicle does not describe a rerouted river, but a quiet entry at night sounds like the gates along the river being carelessly monitored. Either way, the message remains. Cyrus wins with brains and patience, as often as with sharp metal. Visualize his court at Pasargadae after Lydia falls, and before Babylon rises. The mid-540s, Bess, Median nobles in bright patterned trousers and Persian elites in tunics circulate along the palace columns with tall bull capitals. Elamite administrators carry tablets with grievances related to grain. Lydian coiners schooled in metal weights negotiate with Persian overseers in a creole of Greek, Lydian, and Aramaic terms. Messengers leave with sealed orders for Sardis and Ecbatana. Gardeners prune vines near irrigation channels, designed like straight-ruled geometry. The smell of horse and cedar oil mixes in the air. Somewhere nearby sits a plain rectangular basin, a prototype of later Persian gardens that will evolve into a signature of imperial style. The empire already looks cosmopolitan before the word existed. Cyrus's image survives because he makes quality choices that deliver stability. He does not eliminate rebellion. Revolts happen under Persian rule with regularity, from Anatolia to Egypt in later reigns. He gives his empire a spine. He avoids erasing local cultures, which makes tax season less exciting and governance much smoother. He co-opts elites with status and money, keeps a large pool of manpower available by not raising cities, and preserves trade networks that funnel wealth to the center. When he dies, the empire stands on foundations that do not falter just because the founder is gone. The story of Cyrus's death refuses to close neatly, which ironically keeps his legend alive. Herodotus' Tomarus scene is cinematic, and cinema sticks even when the theater's movie stars are invented. The scholarly caution does not blunt its pull. A queen of steppe warriors dunking a king's head in Bloodlands hard, because it reverses the usual power fantasy. Love the image, know its limits. Ctesias' battlefield death with Derbaces reads like professional gossip from a doctor at court who still loves a tall tale. Xenophon's gentle death in bed feels like the immortality project of a philosopher using biography as political treatise. Cyrus's tomb at Pasargadae says the quiet part out loud. He dies. The empire goes on. The stone stands. His successor, Cambyses II, inherits momentum and extends it. He takes Egypt in 525 Beth after the Battle of Pelusium. The empire now touches the Nile. That move owes a direct debt to Cyrus's front-loading of logistics and his clean handling of Babylon, which gives the empire a treasury and a grain corridor. The list of subject peoples grows to a dizzying roster. Persians, Medes, Elamites, Babylonians, Lydians, Ionians, Syrians, Paetrians, Gandharans, and others more obscure in our sources, but no less real. Cyrus shepherds this crowd into a coherent polity. The best sign that Cyrus changed the game comes from his enemies and successors. The Babylonian priesthood accepts him and drafts texts that call him chosen by Marduk. The Greek world, over time, will develop grudges against Persian power, but its literature carries respect for Cyrus specifically. Xenophon writes a book-length reflection that uses Cyrus as a mirror for leadership advice. Alexander the Great pays honor at his tomb. Roman thinkers name Persian kings with grudging admiration. That much respect across cultures rarely attaches to a conqueror unless his governance works on the ground for more than one winning campaign. His empire's soft power is not soft in the sentimental sense. It is strategic culture deployed for compliance. Temple restorations come with expectations. Local elites who keep their privileges owe their loyalty. Exiles who return rebuild, thanks to Persian consent and under Persian oversight. The sieges along the Aegean coast prove that gentle policy has sharp teeth when needed. Harpagus work burning cities that resist shows the stick behind the carrots. The great in later memory without owning an Instagram account. The archaeology of his reign does not flood the record with Persian inscriptions, boasting of achievements in Old Persian cuneiform. That famous medium arrives with Darius at Behistun, the rock billboard that sets the standard for royal public relations. For Cyrus, the gaps leave space for modern scholars to argue across articles and conferences about what counts as his direct work and what belongs to early successors. The safer evidence sits in local records, the Nabonidus chronicles, terse lines, the Cyrus cylinder's official voice, Babylonian economic tablets with dates and royal names that move, the year count smoothly from the reign of Nabonidus to year 1 of Cyrus, king of Babylon. Those documents are the backbone. Without them, Cyrus could vanish into Greek storytelling entirely. The Persian heartland plays its part in shadows. Elamite administrative habits thread through early Achaemenid court life. The language of early inscriptions and receipts preserves an older, regionally rooted bureaucracy. The Persians do not invent bureaucracy. They put it under Persian control and marry it to a mobile army. That combination seems obvious now, only because he proves it works first at imperial scale. The gender of power around him gets less airtime than it should. Mandane, often named as his mother in Herodotus, connects him to the Median royal line, if the tradition holds, though the historical accuracy remains debated. The story reaffirms a truth. Cyrus rises through both conquest and alliance. He marries strategically. He treats Median elite not as conquered foes, but as in-laws. His generals from Media, Harpagus included, become anchors in the West. Even the imagery of Persian kingship blends Median dress with Persian elements. That hybrid look becomes the official style. Visual politics matter as much as tax rates. Coins complicate his story in a good way. Modern minds often assume that the minted coin we all know must be a Persian idea because of the later Daric and Siglos, those elegant Persian issues under Darius. The record is clear. Lydia leads and Cyrus adopts. After Sardis falls, Lydian mints and their staff continue under new management. Weight standards and imagery persist for a time. The empire does not reinvent the wheel. It keeps it spinning. Later, Darius introduces standard coinage, with the gold daric around 515 bais, and Persia stamps its mark on global currency history. Cyrus sets the stage by capturing the mint that matters. A look at his authority titles shows the pragmatic way he inserts himself into older traditions. In Babylon, he calls himself King of Babylon, King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Four Quarters. In Iran, he is King of Anshan, then King of Persia. Greek authors later call him King of Kings, a title attested in Achaemenid contexts more strongly under Darius and Xerxes. The elasticity of titles is not vanity alone. It signals to each subject area that he knows the script. If a land expects a god to confirm its ruler, he claims that gods nod. If a region holds a legal memory of the land of Sumer and Akkad, he steps into that memory and uses it like a throne. The wild card in his legacy is always the Massagetae story. It will not retire. It lodges itself in art and modern retellings. Tomiris, the queen, becomes a symbol standing on her own, independent of Cyrus. Museums show paintings of the blood prophecy fulfilled. It is fine to enjoy the image with historical seatbelts fastened. The caution helps the other parts of the story shine more brightly. Cyrus does not need a cinematic death to be interesting. His life already sets half the continent on a new axis. The empire he builds becomes the stage on which the next 3 centuries of Eurasian drama play out. The Greek world forms and reforms its identity in opposition to Persian power. From Ionian revolt in 499 Bar to the Greco-Persian wars of 492, 479 Bes. Long after Cyrus is gone, the Jewish community's Second Temple period, deeply influenced by Persian rule and policy, shapes religious history for millennia. The idea of imperial roads, couriers, and posts that can move information faster than an army outruns it becomes infrastructure that later empires, from Rome to the Mongols, recognize, adapt, and praise. Cyrus invents none of these in a vacuum. He organizes them with an eye for systems. Even the aesthetics of his empire outlive him in weirdly durable ways. The signature Achaemenid column, capital, with twin bulls, finds echoes in places far outside Iran. Garden layouts that balance water channels and terraces influence horticulture from Mesopotamia to South Asia, to, much later, European garden design that believes geometry can be restful. The tomb at Pasargadae models a royal resting place so stark that it breaks with the elaborate ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the Pyramid Mountains of Egypt. Later, Islamic tradition in Iran keeps an affection for the figure of a just king that arguably carries a shadow of Cyrus's image, filtered through centuries of story and faith. The data points, for the lovers of receipts, stack up like this: 559 Bais. Cyrus becomes king of Anshan. 550 Bis. He dethrones Astyages and merges Media with Persia, taking Ecbatana. 547 Bis. He fights Croesus at Pteria. 546 Bis. He takes Sardis after defeating Lydia at Thimbra. 545. 540 Bis. Harpagus secures the Ionian coast and Caria. 539 Bis. Babylon falls on the 12th of October to Ubar, with Cyrus entering on the 29th of October. 538 Bais. He authorizes returns and restores temples, with evidence in the Cyrus Cylinder and the Book of Ezra. Around 530 Bai, he dies on campaign in the northeast. Somewhere in the 540s, he founds Pasargadae and sets Persian palace style. The clay tablets, the stones, and the later historians align on these beats with the kind of harmony historians live for. There is an irresistible urge to use present-day labels and retrofit them on Cyrus, calling him a liberator, a unifier, a visionary, CEO upgraded to 24-carat royalty. All of that slides toward modern comfort. The reality is more interesting. He is a 6th century Bess warlord with a talent for statecraft that looks modern only because modern governments learn to behave like he did when they want durable power. He is tough enough to take capitals, pragmatic enough to keep them functioning, and smart enough to borrow the gods of others when those gods can help him rule. In an age where conquering meant writing one's name in ash, on a conquered brick, Cyrus writes his name on clay in a way that matters long after the ink dries. The cylinder sits in a museum now, with translations in English and Persian and 1,000 languages of tourist awe. It reads smoothly. It tells a story of legitimacy achieved not by annihilation, but by restoration. The signature line, "If a clay object can have one," is its claim to have returned the gods to their temples and freed people to go home. No global charter, no rights manifesto, but a masterclass in winning hearts with policies that cost less than constant war. The empire Cyrus leaves behind is not some poetic ghost. It is a tax-collecting, oath-taking, garrison-supplied real-world entity. It suffers rebellions and handles them. It negotiates with mountains, rivers, and human obstinacy every day. It pays and equips its soldiers with resources drawn from a geographic quilt that includes the gold of Lydia, the grain of Babylonia, the timber of Phoenicia, and the horse markets of the Iranian plateau. Overseers in Susa and Pasargadae manage a sophisticated reality with the help of men whose names barely survive to us in shards and scribbles. Cyrus stands at the pivot of that creation. The expansion of the Persian Empire does not happen because he is nice. It happens because he is effective. His personal reign lasts less than 30 years, from 559 to 530 Bas. The empire that he founds lasts about 200. That conversion rate is why his name endures across languages. Kurush in Old Persian, Kurus in Elamite, Kairos in Greek, Cyrus in English. The variations tell the same story. A man from Anshan creates something that outlasts him by a factor of 6. A few final myths deserve a friendly takedown. The idea that Cyrus fought without significant resistance is fantasy. The Ionian coastline bleeds. The siege of Sardis is a real fight. The eastern campaigns that claim his life are defined by stubborn enemies who do not simply vanish. The claim that he ruled a modern democracy in spirit belongs in the recycling bin. He rules as a monarch with absolute claims, legitimized by divine narratives. The temptation to find a gentle emperor in every line must yield to the records of real warfare and imperial pressure. The empire he runs leaves footprints deep enough that Alexander the Great later follows them, route by route, city by city. That is the level of infrastructure and memory we are talking about. There is also the recurring claim that the Persians under Cyrus instantly standardized everything they touched. Standardization in weight and measure grows under the Persians, but it is not overnight. It is incremental. The Daric coin appears decades later under Darius. The royal road becomes famous under Darius. The Behistun inscription, that carved novel in 3 scripts, belongs to Darius. Cyrus is the starter, not the finisher, and that fact makes him more, not less, impressive. He builds enough that others can add. Founders are often judged by whether their foundations hold when successors start climbing. Cyrus passes that test. The effect of his conquests on local cultures is both relief and reconfiguration. In Babylon, relief arrives in the temple precincts. In Yehud, pre-Persian Judah, returnees establish a community whose structures and law develop under Persian oversight. The temple's reconstruction starts with Persian permission and resources. In Anatolia, Lydian aristocrats become something else under Persian suzerainty. Some Ionians flee and start new lives in the Western Mediterranean. Others remain and become nodes in a Persian sea network. The texture of daily life changes less than the face on the tax receipt. Cyrus's skill lies in making imperial transformation feel like continuity. His death in 530 BC closes a career, not a chapter. Cambyses II takes the reins. Darius I, a generation later, will carve Behistun to announce his version of legitimacy, including a version of events that cleans up a messy succession. The empire experiences internal conflict in 522 BC, a year of multiple claimants and violent resolution. Those stress tests are severe. The empire survives. Nobody survives a crisis like that, unless the system has resilience built in. Cyrus's skeleton supports the contortions. The irony of his legend is that, for a man who spends his life on the move, his most famous monument is immovable and plain. The tomb at Pasargadae does not scream. It sits. The gabled chamber has no gaudy reliefs of bound prisoners, no scene of the king riding over enemies. Later Greek visitors are struck by the inscription's simplicity. Alexander's soldiers, dirty and tired from a different kind of world conquest, stand by the tomb and remember to act like pilgrims. The site today carries the quiet of genuine history. An UNESCO plaque, a sea of gravel, mountains in the distance, and the sense that a lifetime of brilliant motion ended here in measured stone. The expansion of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great offers a blueprint that every empire after him either imitates or reacts against. Build coalitions from conquered elites, respect local religions, and use them to legitimate rule. Keep trade flowing and mint into local coin systems before building your own. Fix roads. Move messages faster than enemies can. Fight exactly as much as you must and no more. Set a tone that successors can perform without you. That list reads like common sense. Common sense is rare at imperial scale. He manages it. Evidence keeps this grand story honest. The Nabonidus Chronicle anchors Babylon's fall to specific dates in 539 BC. The Cyrus cylinder gives the conqueror's message in Akkadian, with phrases that echo the older kings of Ur and Babylon. Greek historians, each with their agenda, add color that must be cross-checked, not swallowed. Modern scholarship by Bryant, Kurt, and others lays out the administrative and ideological logic of the empire and separates legend from ledger. The archaeology at Pasargadae confirms the architectural revolution. Historical knowledge owes thanks to rows of cuneiform lines written by anonymous scribes, whose job was to note deliveries and record who entered a city on what day. Cyrus' career is funny in another way that does not show up in ancient texts. He would do well on social media. He knows optics. He understands how to frame a takeover as a blessing. He respects existing communities enough to avoid needless provocation. He is ruthless without being performatively cruel. He builds places worth filming. He makes himself quotable with 6-word inscriptions. That combination usually belongs to myth. With him, it belongs to checked facts. Imagine the map again at the moment he dies. The Aegean coast with rebranded Lydian mints. The Anatolian highlands with garrisons at key passes. The cities of Babylonia still vast and self-confident, now ruled by a man whose court sits to the east. The Iranian plateau, woven with roads. The northern steppe line patrolled by riders who stare out at a horizon that offers more raid than state. the eastern satrapies not yet fully named. The Persian core, purring like a well-tuned piece of antique engineering. It is a picture of controlled ambition. Cyrus's fame in later Iranian tradition sometimes merges with other figures, and modern nationalism occasionally uses him like a mirror. The historical Cyrus does not need those reflective tricks. He stands because he built. He endures because he combined a general's decisiveness with a governor's patience. The bronze and stone of empire owe him their balance. The clay of the cylinder gives him a voice that still sounds direct across 25 centuries. He starts as Cyrus of Anshan, a name that, in the mid-6th century boss, sits lower on the prestige chart than Babylon, Nineveh, or even Sardis. He turns that regional throne into a launchpad and never stops moving until his body forces the stop. He wins where another would have burned. He keeps what others would have broken. He leaves a tomb that looks modest and an empire that does not. That reversal is his signature trick. No invented dialogue is needed to feel his presence in the record. The dates, the reliefs, the tablets, and the quiet of Pasargadae say enough. The expansion of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great is the story of how intelligence, adaptability, and polished brutality, used in careful doses, can reshape half a world. The hook is the surprise of Babylon's quiet fall. The punchline is that the quiet was the point. That is how he did it. And that is why his name still carries power.